Hey everyone. Hey, woo, DrupalCon, yeah. Yeah. I want to thank everybody for showing up for my presentation talking about object-oriented CSS, Sass, and how to do it better, in my humble opinion. So here we're at Portland, and we're going to talk about Sass. So just kind of a quick survey of the room. How many people here are new to Sass? Raise hands. Wow, that's epically awesome. Okay, totally cool. How many people here use object-oriented CSS type methods? All right, you are my target audience. Okay, this is totally cool. Okay, jump into this. That's me. My name is Dale Sandy. I work up in Seattle at a place called Substantial. That's Substantial. How many people here from Seattle? All right. We will all get together for coffee later. So this is me on the Twitters. If you find anything I say to be interesting and want to hear more about it, I tweet about this crap all the time. And I also, that's being recorded. And for the people up in Seattle and for the people from Portland who want to drive up to Seattle, if you're ever so inclined. I do also run a Sass meetup up in Seattle. And again, you can follow me on the Twitters. I actually have more people following me on the Twitters at Sass meetup around the world that actually show up to the meetup. So that's pretty cool, I guess. So I talk about a lot of stuff there too. And this is my daughter, Zenna. Today is her birthday. So everybody say, happy birthday, Zenna. Thank you very much. She's so cute. So yes, we're going to talk about Sass, extends, and a concept called silent placeholders, which is really cool when you understand what they're doing and how they can work for you. Ninjas, there's secret code in your code. Yeah. Okay, so object-oriented CSS frameworks attempts at creating objects to streamline application, okay? So we all know that doing things to make things easier usually means you end up writing a crap ton more code, which then makes your life more complicated. So this is the precursor to what I'm gonna talk about here. So object-oriented CSS, Nicole Sullivan taught us some pretty great concepts. You know, identify reusable objects, be semantic with your HTML, minimize your selectors, extend your classes, style separate from content and content separate from container. And this presentation, I'm primarily going to focus on these last three things here. And of course, style separate from content, content separate from container, duh. This is where we need to go. Object-oriented CSS frameworks. CSS frameworks, they've been around for a long time, even before object-oriented CSS came out. I mean, how many people in this room have used like jQuery UI? Okay, so yeah. You all know you put in one module, you just inherited 20,000 lines of CSS. Yay, thank you. Where they fail is that they're constantly trying to solve all of your problems, even though you need to solve one problem. And where a lot of people will look at Sass and go, oh, screw you, Sass people, you're doing nothing but giving me a lot of code bloat. I was like, have you looked at Twitter Bootstrap lately? Okay, 4,914 lines of code before you write line 1 to make it what you want it to look like, not to look like Twitter Bootstrap. I say I don't want that. Okay, pretty simple. Dry coding. We all understand the concept of dry coding. Don't repeat yourself. 9 out of 10 developers agree that this is a great way to do it. That one developer, we just don't talk to him. Bootstrap buttons. Okay, so all I'm going to do right now is just talk about buttons. Very simple concept, right? So let's look at some code for Bootstrap buttons. So, you know, how much CSS can there really be in Bootstrap buttons when we're only just kind of talking about two types of selectors with just, you know, nav tabs and nav pills. I mean, this goes on and 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 on. So that's a lot of code. That's 169 lines of code just for those two selectors right there. That kind of code makes kittens cry. That's horrible. I don't even want to talk about that. CSS, vanilla CSS by itself is not a dry concept. It's a scripting concept that endlessly repeats itself. And we've all been in environments where we create something and then you're working with the designer and you have all these little, 2 pixels here, 2 pixels there, this hex value, this hex value. You're repeating stuff all over the place endlessly. Just in this example alone, there's 10 references to white. It's just like, it's not something that a lot of people like to work with because it's very hard to manage. And what always ends up happening is that, every developer in this room who started working with CSS, I mean, you start out and you're like, this is going to be awesome this time. I'm going to write good CSS. And then the project starts to evolve and then more things happen and then you get more design templates and then now the product is live and you have a maintenance team that are working on it and then they're looking at your CSS and they're like, I don't understand any of this bullshit that's happening on here, so I'm just going to wrap a div around it, slap an ID on it. And I'm just going to go right to the bottom of the CSS, put my ID in there, and I'm going to redefine font families, and I'm going to redefine colors, and it's going to look awesome, and it sucks. Okay. So objects-oriented CSS tries to get us away from that. And the interesting thing about OOCSS is that they readily admit that one of the coolest, best principles of CSS is to extend the design rules of CSS in CSS sucks. Okay, it's hard to do because you have all these lines of CSS and you're like, oh yeah, I want to reuse this thing. And so then I'm going to go all the way up to line 200 something and comma delimit and put my next selector. And then I'm going to go all the way down to line 4,000 something and extend on top of that. And it's very hard to visualize that and to understand that, so nobody ever really does it. So object-oriented CSS says, okay, fine, don't do that. What we want you to do is create all these quote-unquote objects and these little snippets of CSS, and then go into your DOM, and then I want you to put all of the classes, these presentational classes, inside the DOM all over the place. So all great and dandy when you're doing this, but then when you start working with something with Twitter Bootstrap, and then you find yourself, putting 16 classes on a single DOM element just to make a button look the way you want it to look is kind of stupid to me. I don't like it. So you end up with something like this. I mean, here's, you have, this class and 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 this class. And so then as you keep building out templates and modules and stuff, you're repeating this endlessly over and over again. It just gets really complicated to manage from there, especially through the life cycle of a project. You're always going to run into situations where the design is going to evolve, and then you have these presentational classes all over your DOM. And people start doing evil things like rewriting what that presentational class is actually doing, which goes against the naming convention because everybody sucks at naming things. Naming is hard. So it's a great idea to start out with, but it totally lends itself to a lot of problems. So then, again, picking on Twitter buttons, you have all this CSS right here, right? And again, this goes on and on and on. And then your designer comes in and says, I've designed all the buttons. Fuck. That's how I feel when you just said that. No. I'm going to go away. Okay. So, developers, we want our cake and we want to eat it too, right? CSS, we want it to be presentational. It needs to convey design. That's what CSS is for. No, screw you. CSS is to be semantic because I want it to have meaning, right? So vanilla CSS by itself, this is really, really hard to do. Vanilla CSS conveying presentation and semantics is about as realistic as this cat getting another top 10 hit. It's just like, it's not going to happen. So, I've just beat up on object-oriented CSS, so now you're looking at me going, okay, so what's the better way to do it? So then this is when I say object-oriented CSS. Yay! So, placeholder classes. This is a pretty cool concept. I watched the concept evolve with the Sass team for quite a while as, the role of object-oriented CSS started to emerge, and a lot more people were talking about it. And the principal developers, Nathan Weizenbaum, Chris Epstein, and a few others were, on GitHub talking about what if there was a way that we could embrace this without having to do it the way they want us to do it. We can actually embrace it more semantically inside of our CSS and then have all the control from there. So this is where cool stuff starts to happen, and this is where everything I just talked about, the object-oriented CSS, take it and just set it on fire. Forget about it. We're going to learn something else. So here's a simple problem to solve. You have a simple module, it's a box with drop shadow, article, content, and a button. Object-oriented CSS would want us to do something along these lines where you have, a main content, a post summary, a post border, and this is when semantic and presentational all starts living together and not happily. You have a post header, a post button, a primary post button. You just start putting these individual small classes all over your DOM. And you write some CSS that looks like this. This is all pretty cool, and it kind of tells you what you want to do. But as I've been saying before, extending CSS, vanilla CSS, becomes increasingly complicated as you start adding thousands and thousands and more lines of code. Yeah, especially when you hit that number. And, as I've been clearly saying before, it's like extending in the DOM. I don't really like that. And especially when you're working in environments such as Drupal, you don't necessarily always have control over the DOM. You're going to have these prefabricated things inside of your development environment. You can't just go over there and just start spackling new classes in there as you need. So you end up coming up with like crazy CSS tricks to force things around. So object-oriented SCSS basically says I'm going to be more semantic in my use of my CSS. I'm going to use something like, a main content, which conveys simple meaning about the block that I'm working with. I'm going to use semantic classes and use the power of that class to hinge all of my design patterns off of that. You can start coming up with very common patterns and very common use cases with these naming conventions, which then gives you the full strength of developing everything from your CSS perspective. And, as you're redesigning stuff and your designer comes in all the time and asks for new stuff, you don't ever have to touch the markup. You do it on your CSS. So one of the first tricks that kind of came out of this was using Mixins. How many people here know what Mixins are? Wow, okay. So very simply put, Mixins is a great tool inside of Sass. It is probably one of the first major power tools that came out of Sass that allows you to encapsulate a chunk of CSS and then reuse it inside of the rest of the stuff that you're writing again and again and again. And this is all great and wonderful. Mixins are never processed into CSS until you actually include them into another selector. They are much easier to reuse than standard CSS. And in this particular example here, you can basically see that we've combined all of these mixins into a simple module, which, that module by itself looks pretty awesome, and, it's simple to maintain. So, but mixins, as we all know, the robot will copy and paste what's happening. And they will duplicate endlessly with every time that you use it. So this looks pretty clean, this looks pretty awesome, but for reuse, it's going to duplicate everything. So here's a use case of building out that module that I showed before using just mixins. This is great. I'm really reusing some code. This is so dry. I feel so awesome. But then the sad thing is that when we start to duplicate things again, and then we look at our output CSS, we realize that we're living a lie. Because this isn't dry. I mean, our Sass is dry, but our CSS is endlessly duplicating things again and again and again. So that makes me feel sad inside. Yeah, poor kitty. So then this is where the conversation with object-oriented CSS and Sass started to bubble up in the GitHubs like I was talking about. And there was a lot of really cool conversations going back and forth. And the problem that they wanted to solve is how can we very easily create something like a mixin, but it doesn't perform like a mixin, and that's where the concept of extends came in. Now, in this example here, I replaced the mixin with a period and made it a standard CSS, and then down here is where basically I'm combining all of those things into a nice module. It's all pretty cool. But all of these classes will get processed into CSS. So now you're kind of going against what the Mixins were doing for the sake of lack of duplication. So when you start working in an environment where you're building out object-oriented CSS and you have all these very presentational classes, primary border, padding left, padding right, yada yada, even though you're not actually using any of those classes with your final widget that you're producing, all of that CSS gets produced. And so in essence, you're kind of creating unnecessary code bloat for the sake of trying to create something semantic. So this is what our process CSS looks like. You know, here's an object class, there's a semantic class, object class, semantic class, object class, semantic class. So again, you look at your output CSS and you're like, I'm feeling a little dirty here because I'm telling everybody I'm doing cool shit, but I'm not really doing anything. So baby steps, we're walking towards it, okay? So then another conversation starts bubbling up on the GitHubs. And they're basically responding to the very quick feedback to extends that says, you know, I'm producing classes even though I don't want to use the classes. Is there a better way to do this? And this is where Chris Epstein, everybody knows who Chris Epstein is. He's the one who created Compass, the magical compass. Yay. Not so much? Okay. So then Chris kind of started the conversation where he was like, wouldn't it be cool if there was a way that we could do this without producing all the extra CSS? So that's when they started coming up with silent placeholder, placeholder selector, such and so forth. And a number of names kind of started floating around. So the concept behind placeholder selectors is, again, going back to object-oriented CSS. Let's understand the principles of our designs. Let's understand what these reusable widgets are. Let's understand what these reusable patterns are. And let's create them and give them purely presentational names. So you're gonna, create something like default block and default border and post header. And these are purely presentational and they convey enough meaning to understand that when you're applying them to CSS, this is the look that you're gonna get when they get applied. So when I come down here to post summary again in this later example, so yeah, to create a silent placeholder, all you simply do is replace the dot for a class with a % symbol, and then it becomes silent. None of these classes are actually produced in your output CSS until you actually invoke them within another selector that is actually going to produce CSS. So I got my post summary example down here. I combine these all into a nice little module. And at the end of it, here's my CSS. Here's my output CSS. And this is very clean, and this is exactly what we are looking for, and this is exactly what we are hoping for. It looks much like the Mixin solution, but no styles are going to be duplicated or harmed in this process. Styles are reused, and now going back to what I was saying before about extending CSS inside of the CSS is a ridiculously complicated process of doing things because you have to understand and remember where all these things are that you want to extend. Placeholders completely take that away from you. I mean, just imagine having a library of all these reusable things, and then as you're creating a new selector and you want to use those new things, you basically just say add extend standard border, add extend standard title, add extend border right, or whatever it is that you want to use. And then Sass knows where that code lives, what it's associated with, and it's going to output the best possible CSS extending that series of CSS rules. So, no unsightly presentational classes. You have a good semantic meaning, and it's an elegant solution from which, you're extending in the CSS and out of the markup. So this time, the robot's going to make us happy, because I'm doing the post summary and then I'm doing the main article, and then I'm extending all those silent placeholders that I showed in the previous slide. So again, we're saying this is great. We're really reusing some code. This is so dry, and we are so right this time, okay? Because now I have post summary and main article are extending the same CSS rules. Post summary and main article just throughout the entire thing. And reuse without duplication, and free bird. Sweet. Everybody rejoices. This is great stuff. But extending selectors is dangerous. Okay? There's things that you can do that can really screw up your CSS output. And I'm going to talk about a couple of do's and don'ts kind of real quickly here. So, as a rule of thumb, I don't intermingle selector types. I like, presentational and functional is how I like to refer to them, and I typically try to keep them very separate from each other. But why? It reduces readability, because as you're scanning through a document of all of these CSS rules, it's like, oh, that's a placeholder, and that's a real CSS, and that's a placeholder. It just gets confusing. We have the ability to make things less confusing, so don't make them confusing because you want to. Reduces findability. Again, it's like when you're digging around for a certain piece of code, if you find yourself using the find option in your entire application build just to find out where a selector is, then that's a good smell that you're probably doing something wrong and everything's all just mushed together. And another thing is that it reduces importability. By importability, I mean this rule also very much applies to the use of Mixins. If you have a chunk of Sass code where its purpose is to be functional versus presentational, depending on how your architecture is set up from Sass, because everybody understands that there's the @import feature for Sass, okay? If you have a document over here that's importing this document over here, and it has functional and presentational inside of it, and the reason you're importing it is because you want the functional chunk of that code, Sass isn't necessarily smart enough to say, oh, I've already processed those other CSS classes, and so I shouldn't do it again. What it's actually going to do is it's going to keep importing it again. So if you happen to be in a scenario where you have a series of style sheets and then one style sheet imports another style sheet, which imports another style sheet, just so you can get that chain going together, and then you import that into something else, and you have this endless loop of hell going on, and you look at your output CSS, you'd be like, why is default container represented in my output CSS 36 times? That's why. Okay, so you want to keep a separation of concerns when you're doing these things. I'm an advocate for this type of folder structure where I look at my Sass architecture in a very modular perspective. I'll look at something like buttons on a root level of the file structure and say that this is going to be my presentational output. Okay, so this is where I'm actually going to put CSS classes that's going to get turned into actual CSS that's going to be used in the application. And then I'll have a folder sitting in there, and the folder is what's going to contain all of the functional. And inside of there, I'll keep Mixins even separate from placeholder classes. So keeping a good separation between functional and presentational is definitely going to save your bacon in the long run, because you'll know where things are. You'll come up with a consistent pattern on how to find things. And then whenever you're creating a new selector, you never have to sit there and look at yourself and go, it's like, oh, where's a good place to put this other than line 5,000? So it's a good way to keep things very structurally organized. Presentational, functional, awesome. So the next thing that's really going to get you in trouble is extending native selectors. Okay. The way extends work is pretty awesome, but pretty dangerous all at the same time. So this is an actual definition that comes from the Sass website. That extends works by inserting the extending selector, ergo H1 in this example, anywhere in the style sheet that the extended selector appears. Okay, so even like in this example, if I'm extending the H1 nested inside of episode header, what Sass is going to do is goes, oh, you want to extend H1? Awesome. I'm going to find all of the possible instances of H1, and I'm going to extend them in all the possible ways that I possibly can, and I'm going to create a whole shit ton of selectors, even though the one that you want is in there, but it's surrounded by 17,000 other selectors, and you will end up with this. This actually exists in a project that's out in the world that I can't touch anymore. So I kind of refer this as that the unicorn basically came and just puked all over your code. Okay. Magical. So extend placeholder selectors. So even though you can engineer a block of Sass and you're going to say like, oh, I just want to simply reuse this thing, and you can do that. More and more often I find myself with the unicorn puking all over my code, and then I go look in Inspector, and then I hate myself. So what I'll typically do is that if I find myself in a situation like it's a really great idea for me to extend these series of rules, I will actually extrapolate them from the one thing that I want to extend from. I will create a silent placeholder. I will put that in the extends folder in my magical folder structure. And then I will then extend that into the 2+ use cases that I want to use it. And the benefit that you're going to get from that is now you have control over the output. You have control over where these classes are going to be extended. You have control on how they're going to be extended, and you're not so susceptible to that insane loop of finding every selector possible, because what you're only selecting is that one silent placeholder, right? So it's the use case of it going totally wonky on you is going to be greatly reduced, and it makes your life a lot easier to deal with. So by simply just changing, instead of extending that H1, what I'm actually doing is extending the principles of what made that H1 and H1 into the different use cases, and then I get a much more concise list of selectors that's going to be using that principle that makes more sense. Awesome. So now, those are some basic uses of using silent placeholders. Silent placeholders also can be used very, very interestingly to almost create a meta-programming type experience inside of your CSS. So in this example here, this is a pretty advanced chunk of Sass that's written here. The first part that we're looking at here is a function. Everybody here know what a function is? No. Okay. So basically, a function in Sass is something that actually allows you to create a very intellectual piece of code which can accept arguments, do a whole bunch of magical things to get it, and then give you a return value. This is very JavaScriptish in a sort of way. So in this example here, this function right here is going to take two arguments, the variable n and the variable d, and the concept of this function is to be the greatest common denominator. And what it's going to do is that as this thing goes through, it constantly cycles through and it keeps spitting out numbers of the greatest common denominator until it gets to 0. Okay. Then below that is a mixin, which basically takes advantage of the value that's output from that greatest common denominator function. And then it again starts spinning it through magical things in Sass, because Sass can now use for loops. Some people, real hardcore like JavaScript people, hate this when they see things like a for loop inside of a for loop. But in Sass world, we don't care, we can do it. And it doesn't cause evil things like JavaScript would do. So what this mixin is then doing is that it's using that value like I talked before, and see, loop through. So the return value from that function is now going inside those for loops, and it's working its way through. I get then what it feeds it into, you'll notice that that is the primary placeholder selector, and it's a selector that's being written on the fly based on the values that it's collected so far out of that function, and then it's creating it as a silent placeholder. Okay. Then the next thing that it's doing is that it's also taking those same values that it's cycling through, and it's extending another silent placeholder. So it's a silent placeholder extending another silent placeholder, and what this allows us to do is, once I include this mixin into my styles, it's actually going to generate, this exact example is going to generate a whole series of every grid type possible that you set up to grid to be a max of. Like, so if you said the max grid type in this particular example is 12, it's going to go through and it's actually going to create every possible grid space within a 12 column grid, one of 2, 1 of 12, 6 of 8, on and on and on, but it's all going to create it all silently. It doesn't exist. So then I can come down here, and then I have foo, which is my semantic class, whatever you want to call it. And then I'm extending grid 5 of 5, and then bar is extending grid 1 of 8. Baz is extending grid 2 of 9, and crypto is extending 2 of 9. And then what you see, the output there below you, is exactly what you would want to see, is like the semantic classes that I created. Sass pulled all those silent placeholders out of that magical function in Mixin that created all these things in basically metaspace. And then it's applying the values to the actual classes that I want to use in my CSS. So if you were to go all the way back to the beginning of this presentation and you wanted to do something like this, you would actually have to have like 500 lines of CSS with all these wonderful things called grid 1 of 2, grid 5 of 6, grid 7 of 8. It's a bunch of crap, and I don't want to look at that anymore. And I don't want to send that over the wire, and I just don't want to deal with it. This makes it so I don't have to deal with it. So that's advanced placeholders. And this chunk of code is actually inspired by a guy named Lou Nelson out of Berlin. He's a super smart cat. He's way smarter than I am. And you can find him out on the GitHubs. And if you're interested in, a lot of these types of crazy loops and things like that, he's got a great series of gists out in GitHub that you can learn from. So, in summary, getting at the end of this whole thing here, the things that we have learned is that object-oriented CSS and UI frameworks can and basically will give you a lot of CSS bloat because they're trying to solve all your problems before you even write any code. So we don't want to deal with that. Managing presentational CSS and extending in the DOM is difficult, complicated, and it has its issues. Extending classes with 4,914 lines of code makes my brain hurt a lot. It's hard. I just can't do it. I can't. Object-oriented CSS is using a CSS, and using a CSS processor will change your life, but I'm sitting in the choir. Everybody loves Sass, so awesome. Mixins was a great start. Mixins still has a very specific role to play in your CSS. I'm not discounting Mixins. But one of the other rules of thumb that you would definitely want to stick with is that if you're creating a chunk of code to be reused and it's not accepting arguments, then that's an opportunity to say that I should be using a silent placeholder. Extends are awesome, but we can do better. Take everything you know about it, set on fire. Foo is the way to go. Questions? Anybody have questions? Sir?
What is a good situation to use Mixin instead of extending silence like that?
Okay, so like I just said, he basically said, what's a good use case of using a Mixin over a silent placeholder and vice versa, basically. When you're going through and you're engineering the CSS for a particular widget, and you see that there's an opportunity there to, abstract some of the stuff out of there because you want to reuse it, then, that's where you look at yourself and go, I'm going to make a placeholder or I'm going to make a Mixin. If you're following a more of an object-oriented CSS principle and you want to start to abstract things that are just purely presentational, but the output is going to be static, then that's when you would want to use a placeholder. If you're starting to extract things that aren't so presentational, and then the use case of using them again, you're actually going to want to change variables on the fly, then that's when you want to use a Mixin, because a Mixin can accept arguments and it'll allow you to reuse that thing, but you're not generating the exact same CSS again. You're generating different CSS based on the arguments you passed into the variables. Does that make sense? Yes?
Hey, are you using silent extends within each other? Like in a project I'm doing right now, I have one for just border, for example, and then the next one under it is if I want to have border and background, and then kind of creating a silent extend built system on top of each other.
Mm-hmm. So you're basically saying like you have your parent selector that you're outputting the CSS, and then you have extend, 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 extend.
No, like
Oh.
I have like a really simple extend, like just a border.
Okay.
And then I have the next extend uses that border extend with a background maybe. So like I have BG background. So like it's an extend using an extend.
Your nesting extends. Okay. Every use case is a little bit differently. You want to pay attention to exactly what it is that you're extending and how that nesting is working. I mean, if you're using silent placeholders,
Yeah, they're all silent.
if they're all silent, there's a good chance that it'll probably work. But as you start nesting things, like I said, the rule of extends is that it's going to go loop through every possible combination and give you your output. So it will work. It can do that. But you just have to be mindful of the output that it's putting out. This is another rule of thumb. I never use extends inside of a mixin, because what can very easily happen there is that as you apply that mixin again to another selector, then you're also injecting all of the code that comes with that extended placeholder, and then it's going to loop through all those different scenarios again, and then you just end up, just all you got to do is do it, and then open Inspector in Chrome, and then look and see if you made good choices or bad choices.
Thanks.
Hey, I have two questions, but I'll go to the back for the second one. The question I have for you immediately is, how do you extend across media queries? I know that makes things kind of blow up right now.
Okay, that's a trick.
I don't mean it to be a trick. I mean,
No. It's a very interesting question. The trick behind it is that you need to have. So basically, how extends work in relationship to media queries is that the extended selector is scoped by the media query. So if you create a media query and then you create another selector and then you want to extend something that is outside of the media query, Sass is basically going to puke on you. Okay. Right now they have a silent fail which says it's not going to work, but in the next version it's going to crash on you. Mm-hmm. So the way to get around that is what I'll typically do is I will create placeholders that are to be used within that media query underneath another media query. So it doesn't have to all live, because the cool thing about Sass is that you can write your selector, right, and then you can nest a media query via the bubble up method, and then you can write all your media query specific Sass based on that one particular selector. So if you have somewhere else in your hierarchy of Sass, you basically have a series of placeholders that are also written underneath the media query that will work. Does that make sense?
I mean, it's a little ambiguous to me. What do you mean, like underneath the media query?
So,
just nested inside of the media query, or
does the internet still work?
Not really. It's not really working.
I kind of have no, the internet doesn't work. No, I'm getting something. So it's basically like a really good example is Nathan Smith wrote an unsemantic grid system, and then one of the things that he did was that he created a whole bunch of placeholder code, and then he has a master import file that he defines a media query, and then he imports all of that placeholder code inside of that media query. So then now all of those placeholders honestly live inside of the media query, and then anytime you create a selector, define the media query, Sass is going, oh yeah, it actually lives under the media query, so it's scoped appropriately, and I will apply it to this particular use case.
Okay, that makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, that was pretty much my question. But I have one more question to add. Now, you said, so should we have to define twice? Like, for example, if we create extends call as borders, and we have a width of 2 pixels, should we define it twice under 2 different media queries?
I mean, again, it totally depends on the use case of how you're trying to build those things. I mean, you could. It doesn't make you feel right.
So we're repeating again, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, there's
entire thing. Yeah, that was my thing actually. Like,
okay.
We started with this, but when it came to media queries, we found that we are repeating ourselves again and again because, like, once for let's say 720, and we have to define the same styles once again for 1024
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to use silent placeholders.
Sure.
So it kind of silent placeholders also fails in this case, right?
Sure, I mean-
But what we are doing, I don't know if there are better ways to do it, but this is something which we do. I just want to verify if that's fine.
Sure.
What we do is we have a mixin,
Uh-huh.
and then also we extend that mixin in an extend. Like we have a mixin. Let's say, for example,
Well, yeah, you can, yeah, that makes sense. I mean,
so that you define it only once, and then for each of the media query, we just go ahead and say include this mixin. So is that?
I mean, if this, okay, where's? How did I do this? Yeah, I mean, if you guys, and people want to, if you guys want to talk this a little bit more
Yeah,
about the session,
sure.
I can show you some examples.
Hi, I know you briefly touched on the fact that you like to use modular file structure, but I guess what I missed was, does that have a special place with OO'S'CSS?
No, that's why I didn't really talk about it that much in this presentation. I have a whole other presentation that you can get from Speaker Deck.
Okay.
It's basically called, you can just Google it. It's Sass, clean out your junk drawer. And the whole premise of that particular presentation is, you know, the horrible practices of everybody just, you know, a lot of people when they come to Sass and then they find out about the ability to create partials. Then they just create a folder called partials.
Right.
And then you just shove all your partials in that folder and you make an endless amount of partials and you do your import thing. And so Sass Clean Out Your Junk Drawer basically talks about how you can have a better folder structure for managing, you know, your elemental styles, your module styles, your layout styles, and then keep them in a place that is consistently usable so that everybody on the team knows where to look for code.
That's very cool. Thank you.
All right, cool.
So I went to Snook's presentation on Smacks.
Yeah, you did.
yesterday, and I've read up on it online, but my approach was similar to yours, although not quite as clean in differentiating between the functional and the presentational. And it seems like what you're saying here is a lot more appealing to me rather than nesting a bunch of classes. Even though there's a bit more, in a certain sense, there's a there is a certain sense of redundancy. But I think you could kind of take Smacks principles for naming your placeholders, possibly. But I mean, it's
There's
yeah.
nothing I'm saying here today is going to say that, you know, the principles of Smacks, the principles of object-oriented CSS and the principles of Smacks are good principles. I'm totally cool with that. And having a consistent naming convention that works within your environment. I mean, and the funny thing is that when we as developers and presentational developers start saying like, you know, I want my stuff to be more semantic. Everybody remembers, you know, when you get into an argument with somebody and the argument ends with, you know, now we're just arguing over semantics. This argument begins with semantics because now you know this is not going to go anywhere, right? So you're fighting over something that is just purely, you know, just totally argumentative. And so if the Smacks naming convention works for you, and that's great, but what I'm advocating for and how I see silent placeholders being used is not creating a bunch of things written in your CSS just for the sake of writing that, but use the silent placeholders to write them and then use them appropriately with the markup that exists in your DOM.
Yeah, I mean, I would see this as more of the primary means of development, and then taking maybe some of the naming convention ideas from Smacks.
A lot of people
But, like,
do that.
Yeah, I mean, his approach seems much more like the classic OOCSS.
Sure. Well, I mean, yeah, his approach is totally talking about like, you know, you're just going to use vanilla CSS, and here's a way to manhandle that. And even if like my manager came up to me and said, I need you just to output some CSS so I can plug it in somewhere, I'm going to write it as Sass and then I'll just give him the output. I don't write CSS anymore.
Yeah.
I actually hate the language.
Yeah, I mean, I had a brief discussion with him. He says like he does use extends and imports, but much more judiciously.
Sure.
And so, I mean, I personally appreciate your approach better.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks for presenting. Two quick questions. One is the Sass file. Are there any known issues with like browsers?
No, because I mean, Sass, the browser never sees Sass. I mean, you're outputting, you're going through a preprocessor that's going to output CSS. So if you do anything that breaks in a browser, I mean, you're just writing broken code. You know, I mean, Sass is not going to do anything that creates browser incompatibilities. Actually, out of all of the preprocessors out on the market, Sass is the one where Nathan Weizenbaum is very specific about honoring the real principles of CSS, honoring the cascade. He understands how CSS works, and he continues to build Sass in that fashion. Whereas, like the guy from Stylus, he's just like, I'm writing a preprocessor, man. I'm just gonna break all the rules. I don't care. And you know, so like, there's developers on the Node side who love that because that's all they want to do is break rules. Cool. So you know, so it's if you're writing valid CSS inside of Sass, you're gonna get valid CSS output, and it's gonna work. What Sass is totally gonna give you is the ability to make it easier.
Okay. And the other question was, are there any online tools such as JS Fiddle or something similar?
Yes. Yes, there is. I'll just go to my local version. Sassmeister.com. Yay. Okay, so this is a project that a friend of mine and I built, and the whole purpose of this project is to show people how to use Sass. And one of the cool things that it does is you can choose between the two syntaxes, Sass and SCSS. And what is also in this list is all of the popular Compass plugins that you hear about on the news and the Twitter feeds. And so you're like, wow, I want to learn how to use Singularity. Okay, so you don't understand how to use Singularity and you don't want to set up an environment to play with Singularity. So come to Sassmeister, put in Singularity code, you write code, and then it spits out CSS, and everybody knows what CSS is supposed to look like, so you draw one-to-one, and then you learn. It's cool.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, I just have a real quick question.
I have a really long answer.
Okay, awesome. Are you at all concerned about the level of specificity with silent extends or silent placeholders?
The level of specificity.
Okay, so
like,
you're not changing your markup. You're just extending your placeholder. And in one of your example slides, that was the good example. You had a block with maybe 20 different selectors all associated with 4 lines of CSS, and I just have concerns that, you know, if you're extending maybe 4 different silent placeholders, that you're then going to have this level of specificity that is then really challenging to change later.
Sure. That is a development principle on how you and your team are basically developing the widgets. I mean, a lot of the scenarios that I find myself in where, you know, we're writing a module that has a specific name, okay? Just by the pure nature of how we're developing things, this thing's gonna have a specific name. But then there's a lot of reused design, presentational things that are gonna get appended to that. So then that's where I make good use of it. But if there are things that are, you know, more generically named, like, you know, this is a primary article or a primary subheader, there's no reason in the rest of your code to change that name.
Sure.
You know, so then that would actually be the class. And you don't actually even need a silent placeholder in that scenario. So it all kind of depends on the use case. You know, I'm not advocating to say that, you know, every design principle should be a silent placeholder and then change every class in your DOM, and because you can extend everything because that's pretty badass.
Right.
What you're going to end up with is a whole bunch of really crappy CSS, and then you just feel bad about yourself.
Cool.
So it's a balance.
Yeah.
It's totally a balance.
I think it's a balance between SMAX and this. You know, it's not an either or thing.
Right. I mean, it's...
Do both.
A tool is a hammer, and I try to make small holes in the wall, not big ones.
Awesome.
So
Thanks a lot.
thank you. Going once. Going twice. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. Woo! Drupal Camp. Sassmeister, use it, love it. It's great. It's out there for you.